Hi to whomever I might be inflicting this video upon. Happy February and welcome to my January reading wrap-up. Now let's just get into the books. I read 7 books this month, I think, which is quite good for me. I think my average is probably like 4, so yay! The very first book I read was Ever so Bittersweet by Carson. I read it on the plane home from Germany and I absolutely loved it. I spent a lot of the flight discussing it with my father. It's essentially an exploration of desire and eroticism, but particularly through like the lenses of early Greek poetry. Because it's non-fiction, I don't really have that much to tell you about it. I thought it was immaculate. I thought it was very interesting and very compellingly written. I consumed it the way I might have consumed an easy bestseller, even though it was, literary theory. And Carson is just so immensely talented and I'm obsessed with her brain. I personally am haunted by the concept of eroticism, so I have been wanting to read this one for a while now. I just think desire and what makes us desire and its representations in literature is such a fascinating theme. The next book is a pretty big departure from Ever so Bittersweet. I read The Inheritance Games by, what's her name? Jennifer Lynn Barnes? I hope I'm right. It's a YA contemporary about this girl called Avery Grams, and she's pretty out of her luck. Her mom's died, her dad's like a deadbeat, she doesn't have a lot of money, she's living out of her car, and then she finds out that this billionaire she has never met in her life left her pretty much all of his fortune. In order to receive the inheritance, he stipulated in the will that she has to live at Hawthorne Manor, which is the name of his house, for a whole year, which of course means she'll have to live with the family who she has pretty much robbed. All of these people who want her dad, who want their inheritance back, she has to live with them for a whole year. And the billionaire, what's his name again? I don't remember his first name. The last name is Hawthorne. He has 4 grandchildren, and they're all these gorgeous, attractive boys. So it's very much like an inverse harem type of situation. It's pretty much like Knives Out meets a reverse harem anime. Honestly, I expected a lot more from this book. Not that I thought it would be life-changing. Obviously, it's the height of escapism and it's supposed to be fun. The house where it's at has all these secret passages and riddles and games because the grandfather who left her the will, he loved that kind of thing. So obviously I entered just thinking, oh, this will be fun and creative. But honestly, it didn't give me the vibes I wanted it to be. I wanted it to have that, real Knives Out, autumny, mysterious feel. But I honestly don't think it felt like that. There was so much of a focus on the boys and her relationship with them. It felt a lot more romancy. I wanted more mystery. I wanted it to be more suspenseful, and I honestly just wanted stronger vibes. And I just felt it read kind of cheap because of the way she wrote her relationship to the boys, because it's not I don't have anything against romance, by the way. I entered this knowing there was romance, knowing there was a reverse harem type of situation, and I was excited by that. I think it's adorable. But it's just that every single one of them, the first time you meet them, she describes them as the most gorgeous man alive, and that kind of dramatic YA thing where the main character meets a boy and is immediately struck with a stroke or something, and it's girl, you're not gonna have a heart attack over this man you just met. Please relax. And every single interaction she has with them is kind of charged with that energy, and I was kind of do we really have to go in that direction? I don't know, I wanted more of Avery, of the main character, because she is so smart. I entered thinking she would really be painted as this chess genius, can guess all the riddles and work through all of these things. But actually she kind of takes a background position in relation to the boys. She's not the prodigy I understood she was from how people talked about the book. The boys were the prodigies and they guessed a lot of the riddles and stuff, and she was just kind of along for the ride, and I didn't like that. I wanted her to really fit into this space of mystery and games and all of that, and she didn't that much. So I wanted her to be smarter, I wanted the boys to be less important, and I wanted the vibes to be stronger. So I gave it like a 2.5. Thought about being more generous and giving 3. I thought about being harsher and giving 2. So I just decided to stay there. I get why a lot of people like this book, and I'm reflecting about whether or not I want to read the second one, because I think it might get better. But yeah, this was a pretty big disappointment. After that disappointment, I decided to go back to something I know never disappoints me, which is Holly Black's The Folk of the Air series. If you don't know me, you might not know that I am absolutely obsessed with the Crow Prince, with the trilogy. I love Jude. I spend a lot of hours of my life just scrolling through Jude Watch edits on TikTok, and it's really one of my absolute favorite fantasy series, and I will defend it with my life. And Holly Black came out with The Stolen Heir, which is like not a sequel but like a spin-off following Oak, who is Jude's little brother. So I decided to read the original trilogy, The Crow Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing. I'm just gonna talk about them as a whole here. So The Crow Prince follows this girl called Jude. She has a twin, and she used to have a pretty normal life back home with her parents and her twin and older sister. But then one day, this green dude appears at her like doorstep and murders her parents. It's the first chapter. Turns out this guy is a general in Fairyland, and he's the father of her eldest sister. So he, for like honor reasons, adopts the 3 of them, not just like his actual daughter, and takes them back to his manor in Fairyland and raises them there. Now Jude is 17, and you're basically just following her as she tries to carve up some space for her in this extremely hostile environment where humans are constantly like discriminated against and put at a disadvantage. I genuinely think The Folk of the Air series is an extremely well-crafted fantasy. I feel like a lot of times people like underestimate it because there's a lot of focus on the romance online when people talk about this, and it is very much like a story for teenage girls. Like, it feels like that, but that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that it can't be expertly created. And I genuinely think it's a lot better than a lot of very famous fantasy series, and I just have a lot of fun with it. I think Holly Black's take on fairies and Fairyland is great. I think she paints a very colorful and vibrant picture of the environment to us. I think the character dynamics are really interesting. Jude with her twin Taryn, and the idea of her being raised and coming to love the man who murdered her parents in front of her. And obviously her relationship to Carden, who is the cruel prince in question, a prince of Fairyland with whom she studies and has like a rivalry with. But the real star of The Folk of the Air is Jude, which might seem obvious, like she's the main character, right? But honestly, I feel like in a lot of YA books, the female main character isn't the actual like star of the show. A lot of times it's her love interest or just like the setting or something. Oftentimes these characters don't actually have such a compelling personality or arc as Jude does, and I think she's so refreshing as a YA female protagonist because she's just a lot more like ruthless than we usually see, and she isn't helpless. She knows how to play the game. She doesn't ever like rely on her love interest for that, and I get why a lot of YA female protagonists are like that. Ignoring all the criticisms I might have to how that reflects just an idea of gender as a whole, a lot of these stories are about girls starting out like weak and powerless and growing to have power. Like, for example, Alina in the Grishaverse, I think she's a so-and-so character, but like it's not inherently bad that she's powerless at the beginning. Like, that's the story. And even like a series I hate, A Carton, and Roses, like I hate that book, and I think Farah is an awful character, but I don't think it's necessarily because she's powerless in the beginning. Like, a lot of these stories are about gaining power, but I think that Jude has such a different approach to it in that she never ever waits to be granted it. Her wants are always very clearly delineated for you. Like, you're never like, what is Jude's personality? What does she want? Which I feel happens often in YA fantasy. No, it's always very clear like what she's aiming for, and you're just like excited to see how she gets there. I do have some criticisms to the first book. I think back then it really feels, even from the writing, that Holly Black hadn't completely decided what kind of book this would be. So a lot of the first book does kind of read like a cliche bully romance, which is why a lot of people really hated on it back then. I remember when The Cruel Prince first came out, there was a lot of like hate reading and people talking shit about it. And then when The Wicked King came out, it seemed like everyone suddenly changed their minds and it was no longer embarrassing to like these books. And honestly, I 100% get it. I don't think The Cruel Prince is a bad book. I like it, I love reading it, but it really is, especially the last part and just the concept in general, because like when you don't have the context of the other two books, I do think Carden's and Jude's interactions can come across as like an example of so much that is wrong with romance and YA fantasy and the concept of enemies to lovers. If you enter the book thinking like, oh, this is a romance, and you start reading it and really analyzing how Jude and Carden interact, you can be like, girl, what is going on here? Because it really does read like bully romance, and it's not good. Like, as a romance, it's not good. But that's the thing, in the first book, Jude and Carden are not romantic interests at all. Obviously, you have certain conventions that are gonna make it seem quite romantic. The conventions being describe every male character as the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. Obviously, Holly Black was setting that up, so there is like a different kind of tension in their interactions. But really, in the first book, Jude is never like interested in Carden like that. She recognizes he's beautiful in almost like a spiteful way. She doesn't want to be with him. She hates his guts. She wants to kill him. Like, so it's not like romanticizing any of that in the first book, because he very clearly like suffers the consequences of his actions, and he's not painted as like hot while he was doing the evil things he did to her. He's pretty much painted as pathetic. Like, by the end of the book, you're like, yeah, this dude has like no abilities. Like, I feel like people don't recognize that much, that Carden is like characterized very differently from most of those enemies to lovers love interests in YA fantasy. He's not like more powerful than her necessarily, like in every sense. He's not like polished and 100 years old and the most powerful like magician alive or something. He's like a 19-year-old alcoholic who no one likes and who's not very good at most things. Like, he's cunning and he's smart, but if Jude wanted to, like she really wanted to, she could easily kill him. And that's something that I find very important in enemies to lovers, because a lot of times people say something is enemies to lovers and it's not. It's like a girl who has no power and a guy who has a lot of power and he mistreats her and she thinks he's hot. That's what people are talking about a lot of the times, and that's not the folk of the year at all. Carden has a lot more social power because he's a prince of fairy and she's a human, but she has a lot of other powers. Physically, she's much stronger than him. She could take him out one-on-one anytime. He doesn't know how to hold a sword. I get why everyone criticized The Cruel Prince back then, and I think Holly Black should have changed a lot of things in that book. I think the writing should have been more stable, because it really like went from this flowery fairy tale language to like casual, almost like tongue-in-cheek modern narrator. And I have been thinking about this for a long time. I don't think that whole initial arc should have been just Jude going to school, because it makes everything feel a lot juvenile and makes it harder for you to understand the cruelty in context. I think that first arc should have been like a long tournament arc, because we have that tournament but it's literally just like one day. I think there should have been some kind of long like competition, which would also justify a lot of Carden's like a hostility towards her, because obviously she's like openly defying him in many ways. But if she was like openly defying him in a competition setting, I feel like that would make a lot of sense for his character to like lash out at that, and it also would have just made it more compelling. But after The Cruel Prince, I think The Wicked King is immaculate. Like, I think that's one of the best YA fantasy books out there. The Queen of Nothing, there are some valid criticisms of it in regards especially to pacing. I do think it went by a little bit too fast, but I disagree with people who don't like the ending. I think it fit well. And I also disagree a lot with people who like didn't like the fact that Carden was being nice to her. Like, I actually saw a lot of people say it was out of character for them to be treating each other well. And I feel like you guys didn't read the books right. Like, being mean in itself isn't Carden's whole personality. It's a lot of a result of how he was raised and how he was neglected. So like, you don't ever want them to go past their traumas. They can still be interesting and defy each other without, like, you know, actually actively hating each other and mistreating each other. I feel like people didn't actually read the book, because even by the end of the first book, Carden was already being like way nicer. Like, when Carden and Jude are left alone at the end, he like drops the act, and he like doesn't carry on that cruel personality the whole way. So like, obviously they will always have tension, and he will always be a fairy, which means he has like strange tastes, but it's not out of character for him to be nice to her. He's in love with her, and we know fairies can be nice. Like, we have that information. All of that said, I just want to add that I think Carden is like the best YA fantasy love interest. I think he's a lot deeper, and you know, it sounds bad, especially back then when there was just a cruel prince, the idea that like his actions are quote-unquote justified by like the trauma he experienced. But I do think it's very different from just being like, oh, he's mean to me because his dad mistreated him. I don't think in a Book of the Year it ever reads as if those actions by Carden were justified like in the first book, because he's not a love interest while he's doing those actions. Jude has another love interest at that time. He's 100% just the antagonist, and she's never like, oh, he's so mean to me, but I love him anyway. Like, no, she's always like, you're a fucking dick, man. And she always like tries to punish him for it. That's the whole first book. Also, most unpopular opinion of all time, I am a Taryn Duarte stan. Argue with me. So now we're getting to the book that I actually reread the trilogy in preparation for, which is The Stolen Heir, which supposedly is described as Oak's story, but it's not really Oak's story, it's Wren's. So in case you don't know, Oak is Jude's brother, but he's actually really Carden's nephew, I think. So he's next in life for the throne. He's the heir of Elfheim. And so this book is supposed to follow like his adventures and explore how he feels about being the heir. But he's not actually the protagonist, like he doesn't have a point of view. The one who has a point of view is Wren, who we saw in the last book as the child queen of the Court of Thieves. She was the child of two antagonists, and she was really mistreated and quite mysterious, and she's actually the protagonist here. So she's a fairy, and she lives in the human world because she's not the biggest fan of fairies, and she's kind of like down on her luck. She's like living in the woods and just wallowing in self-pity kinda. The only purpose she has is breaking curses set by other fairies. She's very like pro-human, so she tries to help humans by breaking their curses, and that's basically how we find her. The thing with Wren is that she didn't actually grow up in fairyland. Her parents put her in the human world for like a political reason, so she was raised there by like a loving human family, and she really wishes she could return, and that's basically like the crux of her character. And then obviously, for whatever reason, her and Oak meet and they go on this adventure together. I didn't like this book very much, and I'm really sad about it because I love this world and I really like Holly Black, and I really wanted to really enjoy this. And I was excited because I think Bran or Suren is a very interesting character, and I was also very excited about Oak. I always liked him, even back in the Book of the Year. But I think a lot of bad choices were made when concocting this book, and I'll explain why. The first thing, the main thing, which is something I didn't exactly realize while reading it, but afterwards I was like, what is it like? Because I finished and I was like, I didn't love this. Why? And I realized that it's because Wren should not have been the main character. The book was even sold as Oak's story, not Wren's, and I think it should have been Oak's story. I think he should have been the protagonist. He should have had a point of view, or at least it should have been dual point of view. I feel like that would have worked really well too, because like Wren isn't actually very consequential. Like when you compare her to Jude, I feel like she exemplifies a lot more of those negative cliches about YA female characters. She's very helpless. She's like, she has no power. She's super insecure, shy. She doesn't really have the confidence to do, like, go and do things. She's always kept in the dark. Like, she doesn't know things about the adventure, so you don't either. And it's not in like a mysterious way, it's just like, I'm missing all the fun parts way. Meanwhile, Oak is a much more interesting character. Like, he's burdened with being the heir to Elfheim, which is a burden he doesn't want. He like constantly suffers assassination attempts because obviously people challenge like Jude and Carden's reign. He is more of a politician, of course, because he has grown up in court, and he's just really like brazen and confident, and he is pulling the strings. And I feel like when you go from Folk of the Air with that confident, strong, powerful character, and then you go to Ren, it's kind of like, why should I care about you? We are used to being with Jude, who is this powerful, strong-willed character, and then you go to this character who like has no power ever and is never like actually involved in the interesting things. And it's not that Ren, like in her conception, is a bad character. I just think she should have been written much more compellingly, and she should have had more access and more agency, like access to information. And if Holly Black wanted to tell her story, I really think it should have been dual point of view, because I really feel that a lot of Oak's moments we missed would have been much more interesting to read about than a lot of what Ren did. And also just the type of story it is, I feel like it would match a dual point of view kind of structure. Like in the Folk of the Air, I don't think it would have made any sense for us to have Carden's point of view, because he's supposed to be an antagonist in the beginning, and he is supposed to be like this mysterious, inscrutable like creature, especially because that first book has a lot more of that like fish out of water otherworld like characteristic, because Jude is human in a country of fairies, so we as humans feel a little bit more comfortable in her point of view, experiencing things through her. But here we have two main characters who are both fairies, so like there isn't really that thing about needing to have like a stand-in for the audience, especially because if you read this, you probably have already read the Crouprints, so you don't need that much explained to you. So why not just have two fairy point of views? Also, one thing I was excited for with having fairy point of views was like a more otherworldly, ethereal vibe, and Ren reads very human, and that bothered me. Like, yeah, she was raised a lot in the human world, but she is a fairy, and she also lived a long time in fairyland with like all the machinations of fairyland. So why wouldn't you have more of that fairy cunning? When you tell me your protagonist has blue skin and shark teeth, I expect her to feel supernatural, not like a high school like insecure girl. Also, this is kind of a pet peeve, but it bothered me how often like the narration would mention their supernatural physical aspects, because Oak has goat's feet and Siren obviously is literally blue. And like what bothered me is that the narration, which is in first like person point of view, acted like it were constantly like shocked by those characteristics, like constantly mentioning them. And it's like, if you are a supernatural character, you're not gonna be shocked over your own supernatural characteristics and others' supernatural characteristics. So I don't know, I felt like this book missed the mark quite heavily, and it could have been very, very, very good. At points in its favor, Elfheim is always fun. I like that we got to explore more of it. The Court of Moths, was it? I think so. The Court of Moths was very interesting to see, and I think the finale was cool. It also missed some stuff, but the finale was cool, and I'm excited to see what Ren becomes after that finale. And I heard that the next book is actually from Oak's point of view. Wouldn't it have made so much more sense for this one to be Oak's point of view and the next one to be Ren's? Like, if you know the finale, don't you think that makes more sense? I don't know. I'm also really excited to see Carden and Jude again, because they don't appear in this at all. I thought they might appear a little bit at the beginning at least, but I didn't. They're mentioned, and every time they're mentioned, I'm like, wow, fangirl squealing. And I am very excited to see them in the next book, especially because we might see them in a very particular role that we haven't seen them in before. And I don't know, I'm excited. So yeah, that was The Stolen Heir. I think I gave it like 3 stars. I did have some fun reading it, but it bothered me a lot. Next, to finish this whole Elfheim part of the book wrap-up, I read How the King of Elfheim Learned to Hate Stories, and I love that book so much. I love Carden. I am actually planning a whole video about him. It's like an analysis of how fairies are portrayed currently in fantasy and why he is hot. It's literally like examining what makes him hotter than other like fairy main characters and love interests to me. I read Arrows of Bittersweet, and now I think a lot about eroticism in literature. How the King of Elfheim Learned to Hate Stories is a book focusing on Carden. We learn a lot more about his youth, his childhood, his relationship to his mother, and a lot of stuff that happened in the Cruel Prince from his point of view. And there's also like a new little adventure with him and Jude. I think this book is adorable. I love the way Carden's character is constructed. It's illustrated and the drawings are beautiful and exactly how I imagined the character, so that's really good too. I don't have that much to talk about it. It's just like a short, sweet, kind of perfect book actually. After it, I was gonna reread The Lost Sisters, but then I just kind of got tired a little bit and decided to go in another direction. This month is funny because it was literally like YA fantasy sandwiched between and Carson, which I think is pretty representative of my literary taste actually. So my last book of the month was Anne Carson's translation of Euripides de Bacchae. I had already read the Bacchae, translated to the Portuguese actually, and it was a very different experience from reading Carson's translation because her translation is very transformative. It's really not like faithful to the original text. It doesn't try to be like an exact translation, but like almost a retelling, like not a retelling, but she gives her own spin to it. So you get sentences like, should we get a cab? And it's set in ancient Greece. So I really liked the experience of reading this after having already read a more traditional translation of the Bacchae, but I think all her liberties are very good decisions. Like I think she really like put such a genius spin on the story. You really get the feeling that she understands the original text so deeply, so you really don't mind the fact that she's kind of like perverting it, because it's like, girl, you know what you're doing, right? In case you don't know, Euripides de Bacchae is an ancient Greek play about the god Dionysus and kind of like how he's cementing his own position as a god, and it's honestly extremely interesting. And it almost like, rereading it now, it almost made me want to like actually write a retelling of it, because that idea of like a young god trying to prove his divinity is so interesting. And the play is very gruesome obviously, because the Bacchae are literally like, their hobby is dismembering people, so obviously it's quite gruesome, but it also is very wise and just has so many like profounder meanings to explore. So I highly recommend taking a look at it. But if you're gonna read Carson's translation, seek out a more traditional translation first, or if you know ancient Greek, read the original one. Like if you know ancient Greek, you have already read the Bacchae and all of Anne Carson's bibliography. But yeah, I don't have that much to talk about this one either, because it's just like, it's the Bacchae. Like, what am I gonna add to the conversation? So those were all the books I read in January. I'm quite happy with what I read, and I hope to have an even more successful reading month now in February. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more of this face, and in the description box I have all my usernames if you want to find me elsewhere on social media. If you've read any of these books, feel free to discuss them with me if you disagree or if you do agree, and tell me about what you want to read in February. Bye bye!